After an especially Godzilla-y winter, with one essentially perfect film coming out critically beloved and financially successful, and a second film also coming out financially successful, the future of the main kaiju generally feels more optimistic and secure for Western audiences or Hollywood after a few false starts. But now that he's here, where can he and his genre go next? First, we should probably establish what Godzilla has done so far. Most Godzilla films, and indeed most kaiju films, can be split roughly into two categories: Godzilla First Contact and Godzilla et al. First Contact films include the very first Godzilla, G98, G14, and -1. The story very obviously revolving around Godzilla's first major attack on a public area, and him coming into the public eye, though the usual story is that the government have known about him for a while, though this isn't a necessity. By the end of the film, Godzilla may or may not be dead, but there will be indisputable proof that he did exist, and likely blew up a city or two. The more numerous Godzilla et al. Is when Godzilla's friends come to visit for better or worse. Sometimes they fight and resolve things, sometimes they fight and kill each other, sometimes they team up against someone worse. Either a pre-established foe or one made for the film. Generally, but not always, these are much less imbued with a message or some form of commentary, and start becoming much more about spectacle over story, with the Monsterverse now taking this to its extreme, being at the zenith of spectacle and the nadir of story. Typically this will piggyback off a pre-existing First Contact film as well. So Godzilla has been chugging along for a while, and it's not as if all the Godzilla et al.s are the same. Whilst most First Contact films are generally moody, dark and heavy on theme, almost as if that's how Godzilla works best, the Godzilla et al.s can range from the goofy and cartoonish Showa era to the darker and grittier Heisei era. But for the most part, despite that era's efforts, the former was how the West had mostly viewed Godzilla, due to the reputation Showa set up for it. Godzilla as a franchise was essentially a longer, more expensive Saturday morning cartoon, and not much to pay real attention to outside of that. But recently things changed. It took another First Contact film in G14 to start lumbering forward in the West with an actual series, but one that only wound up critically sinking further with each successive release. But the films did have staying power to some extent. They were making money, and more films were being made for widely Western appeal, which is more than many past films had done despite their local success. But for films to just make money isn't really enough. You never really know when an audience is going to turn on something that persists despite critical roasting. So with -1 to show kaiju films can have a solid story, become a critical darling for the West in a way they hadn't for decades, and make money too, Kaiju/Godzilla now has everything it needs to take off in earnest. Similarly, the environment is just a lot more amenable to it now as well. Thanks to the rise of the MCU and the popularity of Game of Thrones, that lasted well enough for it to resurrect itself in House of the Dragon, audiences in general are much more on board with what can broadly be described as nerd culture. Essentially anything with a sci-fi or fantasy bent, and the urge to both generally consume the media and adjacent merch, and making sure everyone knows that you do as well. And the big sci-fi kaiju lizard who's a symbol of cinema fits like a glove into that category. But with saturation and popularity can sometimes at least come diversity, and with the fresher takes that can come with the future of such genres, it could well be here that kaiju's futures lie. In a lot of cases, the fresher takes are ones best described as revisionist, the reinterpretation of popular forms of media through a modern view, sometimes in direct response to pieces of media that creators felt lacked certain things they would have liked to see, or made as social commentary in response to prevalent recent events. A quote from George R.R. Martin that's been shared and mocked in equal measures is, "What was Aragorn's tax policy?" Of course, there is more to it than just that. Gurm's quote comes from a larger interview, where he discusses the simplistic moral aspects of Tolkien's writing, and his lack of delving into the grimier aspects as he loves to. It's worth noting Tolkien himself did actually consider a glummer thriller sequel, going into some of Gurm's talking points at one point, but he ultimately found it not worth doing. Tolkien's books are much more inspired by Germanic and Arthurian legend through the lens of someone who survived the First World War, whereas Gurm's are much more inspired by historical events like the War of the Roses, and as such reads like an alternate military history, with only the occasional wildcard of a dragon or shadow baby thrown in, as the books get progressively more fantastical with time. Accordingly, the more mundane aspects can be key points. There isn't a battle without the preamble of baggage trains, supply lines and logistics. The effects of war are key too, focusing less on the individual as Tolkien did, and more on the gears and functioning of a nation. Post-Red Wedding Jaime and Brienne chapters in the Riverlands muse on how and who is going to feed everyone, or pay for food to be shipped in, after they obliterated all the crops in the fighting on the cusp of winter. So the literal tax policies and other such points do actually come into things. But from the success of Gurm's writing, it is clear that such talking points can make for good fiction. Gurm isn't trying to rag on or exceed Tolkien as many think, but rather just take fantasy in a different direction it hadn't really gone in before. Dark or morally grey fantasy isn't anything new, but rather delving into the nitty-gritty of fantasy is. Answering, or at least talking about, the more difficult questions, and not providing simple, disposably evil villains, and simple, purely good heroes. Whilst not every trope needs to be subverted, Martin's writing does have a reputation of trying to go against the grain with typical tropes, or other such story points in the genre. The opening book of Game of Thrones starts 17 years after the happy ending, in which the mad evil king and his rule were disposed of. The new king who won the throne with martial prowess is a poor ruler, and also married into a war criminal family. One of Gurm's initial talking points is that someone good at taking a throne via combat may not then be the same type to enjoy sitting on for long periods to natter about peasant policy. So it initially starts asking what happens after this seemingly happy ending. Another chief tentpole of nerd culture too, superheroes, has also been subject to a similar form of revisionism too. Amazon's The Boys asks what if superheroes were real, and then actually real in our world. As such, superheroes are essentially owned by a megacorporation and instead of true heroes, function more as celebrities with manufactured acts of heroism occasionally in between. So whilst Eric Kripke has never said what was Lex Luthor's Superman policy, The Boys does immerse itself in the same topics. Most superhero media has them at least try to maintain a secret identity, and then only really show up when there's trouble, and so they're for the most part good. Again, dark or morally grey superheroes aren't anything new either, but The Boys tries to provide a cynical answer as to what a modern world with superheroes would actually look like. Rather than being sequestered in government hidey holes or private residences until they're needed, Vort's finest are a multi-billion-dollar industry with their fingers in numerous corporate pies, and being marketable points for politicians, as well as having their own entertainment and merch deals. Literal soup policies are a driving plot factor in the first season of the show, so it does technically ask what is Lex Luthor's Superman policy. Whilst in both these examples the revisionist aspect takes a bit of a back seat compared to the character writing as it progresses, it still remains a core part of both going forward. But it's worth noting the whole revisionist aspect doesn't necessarily preclude the core tropes and origins of the genre either, and can still continue to play them straight or with modifications. A Song of Ice and Fire still has plenty of morally good characters, willing to do the right thing and succeed in doing so, the true fantasy hero archetype, as well as some villains who aren't all that complex or morally grey. Similarly, in The Boys there are purely good characters and willing to sink to the level of others, even when in direct conflict with them. So revisionist Godzilla would still be allowed to blow up Tokyo. It's more about what happens after that would make for the major changes. Whilst some Godzilla films have never lacked for politicking, and Godzilla et al. Films often rely on Godzilla's presence already being known, it's not often these two combine in a meaningful way, unless it's something like setting up the creation of a new big bad to fight. Godzilla has always been a sea beast in some sense, and this conveniently allows him to dip out between fight scenes. Unless there's some plot development or new threat that's inevitably going to head to the nearest population centre for a fight, Godzilla is generally happy to vibe out somewhere in the ocean. And no one really sees much point in thinking about him until he returns. This is pretty convenient for everyone involved. Presumably because if he didn't do this, it'd be quite an issue. If he did, and killing him was ostensibly not an option, you'd really have to ask yourself, what exactly is our Godzilla policy? The fact Godzilla is such a big deal means he'd essentially be leeching into every talking point. If you can't kill him, how do you stop him walking through your city? If you can redirect him, where are you redirecting him to, and how much does that cost? What does your voter base think of Godzilla, and what are you going to do about that? What if Godzilla starts smashing up culturally important World Heritage sites that don't have any immediate human life loss? How do you get rid of the body of a kaiju? How can Godzilla or other kaiju be monetized, or in some other way spun for profit? What if kaiju provide significant benefits in some areas but huge deficits in others? Overall, there's a lot you can still ask and answer about Godzilla a lot of media hasn't really touched on with kaiju, especially how you live with them and how their impacts affect the different rungs of society differently, especially with other human influences. There's also no shortage of things that can be explored with Godzilla, both in general and in this context too. The very big and obvious one is of course climate change and everything it entails. And whilst some genres are making uncertain stabs at climate stories, there probably isn't a better genre to explore them than with kaiju. Whilst kaiju also shouldn't be written purely as animals, there are plenty things to explore in that area with kaiju. Much of the world's most dangerous and admired wildlife often live in areas with the least wealthy human populations too. And should the two clash, it's often the humans that get it in the neck in Western media, especially if they dare to attempt defending themselves or their livelihoods, to say nothing of how wealthier nations respond to their own lesser wildlife problems. Kaiju can stand in as a heavily exaggerated form of human-wildlife conflict, and how people react to it depending on who's involved, as well as who's hit hardest by it, why, and what is or isn't done to help. I don't want this video to essentially be me writing fanfiction ideas, so to wrap up this paragraph, there are more topics too. But depressingly, these are just a few of the lighter options. In a time where humanity is generally tampering too much with the biosphere of the only planet it can live on, it does provide pretty ripe fruit for the picking for such allegory. Naturally, this will exclude the option of just killing Godzilla, and whilst I think this is a reasonable approach in a First Contact film, in fact that's often what the endgame of First Contact films is, repeatedly trying to stop Godzilla lethally just treads the same ground in a franchise and the same ground as the genre overall. But Godzilla in this circumstance does have to meet humanity halfway, and such a take would require an indifferent Godzilla over an actively hostile one. Godzilla can still destroy a city and give the action people want through indifference due to being so big, and if Godzilla actively tried to destroy all the Earth's cities, it probably wouldn't lead to new ground being covered, as the only action you can possibly take would be trying to stop him. As well as just breaking new ground, it can also potentially heal a common complaint of many kaiju films. The human plots of many of the more recent films, bar -1 of course, have not been received especially well, often criticised for either sucking, being barely relevant to the kaiju they share the film with, or both. Actually having the kaiju be factors of everyday life mean that whatever human story is going on, it's generally going to be a lot more relevant to the initial draw of the film as well. Part of this idea stems from the fact that at least some properties do seem to be shuffling cautiously towards some revisionist aspects of kaiju and their interpretations. Whilst -1 is still a First Contact film, and follows that formula for the main events of the film, its theme and characters shift the heroics from the government and higher military to the civilians, and Godzilla himself still remains the living embodiment of the Second World War, but this time much more laser-focused to Shikishima's character and his survivor's guilt from said war. On a more world-building level, Legacy of Monsters does a reasonable job at partly setting this up in its first episode. The podcast-informed taxi driver, the Godzilla sirens, the giant turrets. It all does a successful job conveying a world starting to live with Godzilla. Shame about the rest of the modern storyline, really. As obviously it doesn't really go anywhere or do anything more than just set up with it. Though they also can't really be blamed, as there probably isn't kaiju media as willing to dodge asking difficult questions about kaiju as the Monsterverse, considering it created a multi-tiered hollow earth for them to live in precisely so no one needs to do any real thinking. In general, I'm not really expecting the remainder of the Monsterverse to really innovate much in this regard too, but I do think the precedent slowly being set may well cause some interesting new ideas to come in the future. It could be worth adding too that the revisionist angle only seems to come with time as well. Something has to saturate before it can become subject to different takes that may seem imminently less marketable. There was 10 or so years between the Lord of the Rings films and Game of Thrones getting its own adaptation, and a similar amount of time between Iron Man's initial success in 2008 and The Boys premiering in 2019. At press time, kaiju may simply not have had enough time to fully saturate itself positively as a genre with Western audiences, but with 10 years since G14 and a few other properties like Pacific Rim, as well as its aforementioned newfound success, it does seem like people are finally pro-kaiju enough to accept them in new ways. With the earlier point of people in kaiju films often sucking, some may suggest the answer is to remove them, and have the film all about the main events people want to see. But there was one shot in Godzilla x Kong that really made me change my mind on this, when Kong leaps over the giant spine of something vastly larger than himself to cross a canyon. And it made me realise that kaiju should never look small, or even kaiju should never look normal-sized. Not only was that a weird thing to include, because if Godzilla et al. Are just the holdovers from a time when life was even larger than themselves, then he's not really king of the monsters so much as a glorified meso predator, but small or regular kaiju stop being kaiju. They will always work their best when they have humanity and its structures to emphasize their size and power. When you try and make a giant otherworld where they all fit in normally, then that's not really what kaiju are about. Other forms of movie monster, sure, or interpretations such as earlier iterations of Kong made without Godzilla in mind. But in the context of our world, kaiju should always be, as their name implies, strange beasts. Although with that said, people doesn't always mean talking. After seeing Denis Villeneuve's comments on dialogue in film, and also seeing Dune Part 2, I don't think there's another director I want to see try Godzilla more. One could argue with the whole sandworm thing, he already knows his way around kaiju pretty well. Thanks for watching, and thanks too to my patrons. The Superist Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Holden, Nickname 3110, Eringar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Dapperaptor, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu for their continuing generosity helping to support the channel. If you'd like to sign up, there's a link in the description, and you'll be able to vote on future videos, with any amount always being appreciated. This topic won out against a video that would have been a lot longer, so I'm pretty glad this shorter, sweeter topic was picked after the Spec Evo long. If this is my first video of yours, then do go and check some of my other content. And if you enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing. Next time will be another Monster Hunter video of some sort, so hopefully I'll see you there for that.